My husband left me and our newborn at the hospital with $3 for the bus so his mother could ride in my car. He didn't know. I was a secret billionaire. The receipt was still warm from his pocket when he pressed the money into my palm. 3 crumpled dollar bills, and a quarter in my freezing hand. "Don't make this hard, Elena," Marcus said, already turning toward the car. I stood on the curb outside Mercy General Hospital, 4 days post-surgery, holding our newborn son, Leo, against my chest. The bitter November air cut right through my thin cardigan. My incision burned with every single breath, a tight, screaming red line under my waistband that pulled agonizingly when I shifted Leo's weight. I hadn't even been cleared by the doctors to lift anything heavier than my baby. I certainly hadn't been cleared to stand upright this long. Helen, my mother-in-law, sat in the passenger seat of my Audi Q7, fixing her lipstick in the visor mirror like she had all the time in the world. That car was bought 2 years before I ever met Marcus. Paid off in full, registered in my name alone. My sister-in-law, Chloe, leaned across the back seat and rolled down the window. "There's a reservation at 8, she snapped. "Don't be late." I looked at Marcus. I waited for him to say anything that would make this make sense. He checked his watch instead. "You'll figure it out," he sighed. "You always do." I desperately tried to line up the man standing in front of me with the version of him who had sat in the delivery room 4 days earlier, gripping my hand so hard it left bruises, screaming at the surgical team when the fetal monitor dropped that they'd better not lose either of us. The two versions wouldn't overlap. I remember the dizzying physical sensation of trying to hold both of those men in my head at once, and completely failing. Then he got in, pulled away from the curb, and I watched the taillights shrink down Montgomery Boulevard until they turned and vanished. A hospital security guard, a heavy-set older man named Miller, came over and gently asked if I needed a wheelchair to the pickup lane. I told him I was fine. I wasn't. An off-shift nurse helped me carry the heavy car seat up the steep steps of the number 14 bus. Leo slept through the whole thing, his tiny fist curled against his cheek. I sat by the scratched window and watched the city go by in broken pieces: a laundromat, a shuttered diner, a church banner. And somewhere between the third stop and the fifth, I stopped waiting for this to feel like a mistake that would resolve itself. I didn't cry on that bus. People expect tears at a moment like that. What I felt instead was significantly colder, and infinitely steadier. It was 3 years of small, dismissive warnings arriving all at once, stacked up, and finally completely legible. The way he'd told a room of investors that a quiet wife makes for a happy home, and I just raised my glass and smiled. The way he'd rescheduled 2 of my vital prenatal appointments so Chloe could show a waterfront listing. The way he'd asked me, while we stood in a shop choosing wedding napkins, whether my father might just write a check for the honeymoon and stay home from the ceremony. I had an excuse ready for him every single time. That morning, riding a city bus home with fresh surgical stitches tearing under my clothes, I ran out of excuses. Here is what Marcus Thorne never knew. My name is not really Elena Vance. Legally, it never changed, but I let him believe that meant nothing. I am Elena Sterling. My father is Arthur Sterling, founder of Sterling Global Partners, the massive private banking group that quietly finances more than half the mid-size construction lending in this entire state. I never lied about my last name outright. I simply let Marcus assume what he clearly wanted to assume, that my father ran a small, modest distribution business somewhere upstate. The kind of thing you inherit and keep quiet, not the kind of empire that gets your photograph put on the cover of financial trade magazines twice a year. I wanted, for once in my entire privileged life, to be loved for the version of me that didn't come with a massive balance sheet attached. For 3 years, that arrangement held. And for 3 years, Marcus's real estate company, Thorne Development, grew at a terrifying pace that should have alarmed me. 3 massive developments broken ground in 24 months. A massive waterfront project, Harbor View, that by every normal metric he shouldn't have been able to finance. I told myself he was simply a brilliant negotiator. I ignored the way certain high-level investors looked at me a beat too long at dinners, like they were waiting for me to confirm a secret I hadn't spoken. When the bus let me off 2 blocks from our building, I walked the rest of the way, holding Leo against my chest with one arm and the heavy diaper bag looped over the other shoulder. My incision was screaming, bleeding slightly through my bandages with every single step. By the time I reached our apartment at the Wellington, the elevator ride felt like the longest 7 floors of my life. The apartment smelled heavily of garlic when I finally got the door open. Helen hadn't even left me a plate of food. I sat down at the kitchen table with my sleeping son against my shoulder, pulled out my phone, and made exactly one phone call. Not to a friend. Not to a divorce lawyer. To my father. He went completely quiet in the very particular way he does right before he decides to professionally execute someone. "Stay exactly where you are," my father said, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't unpack anything. Don't argue with me about this." 20 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up outside the Wellington. My father's chief of staff, David Hughes, stepped out in a tailored suit that had clearly been thrown on in a massive hurry, his tie slightly crooked. Behind him, a second car brought a private postpartum nurse and a lactation consultant. Both were already carrying medical equipment bags, walking toward my door before I'd even finished crying into the phone. That was the exact moment I understood the two lives I'd been straddling for 3 years were about to violently collide, and only one of them was going to survive the impact. My father's estate, Oakmont, sits on 15 acres behind a massive stone wall. Marcus had driven past those iron gates a dozen times over the years on his way to meet other clients, never once knowing they belonged to my family. That night, with David's help, I made it there. Instead of staying in an apartment that smelled like my mother-in-law's dinner, I sat in my father's mahogany study. He listened to the entire story without interrupting once, sitting perfectly still in his leather chair, his reading glasses pushed up into his silver hair. When I got to the part about the $3.25 bus fare, his jaw did something terrifying that I hadn't seen it do since the year my mother passed away. His phone rang in the middle of it. It was Marcus. Wanting to know where dinner was. Not asking about his 4-day-old son. Asking about dinner. My father stood up slowly and set his own phone face down on the table. "Cut that line," he said to David. "Block every number he has for me, for the house, for the office." Then my father picked up a second phone, already dialing. "Get me legal. Get me the CFO. I want every single guarantee touching Marcus Thorne's projects pulled up on my desk by morning." I sat up straighter, and my incision pulled so hard I gasped. "Dad." Every bank that extended him credit did it, believing Sterling Global stood behind him in some capacity. I said, realizing the domino effect. "He built an empire on a name he swore he didn't even know he'd married into." My father said, not looking at me. "And 4 days after you gave him a son, he put you on a public bus." He turned back to the phone. "Freeze anything touching his active projects. I want a full forensic audit of every account with informal ties to us by 6 a.m. Across the city, in an apartment that used to be mine, Marcus was pacing the kitchen, furious that his dinner wasn't ready, calling a number that had already gone dead. He had absolutely no idea what had just been set into motion. He had no idea that every signature, every quiet, informal assurance that had let banks extend him millions more in credit than he'd ever actually earned was about to unravel in one silent, deliberate motion. I felt something on that leather chair I hadn't let myself feel on the curb. Not grief. Just a cold, settled certainty that Marcus had no idea what he'd started. Update 1. To understand how we got to that curb, you have to go back 3 years to a spring gala for a children's hospital wing. I was 28, working under the name Elena Vance as an urban planning consultant. It was the kind of job that let me sit in rooms with developers without anyone assuming I had old money. Marcus was 33, building Thorne Development, telling anyone who'd listen that he started with nothing but a contractor's license and a truck. He found me by the dessert table. He was charming, attentive, and by any honest measure, incredibly good to me in those first 8 months. He remembered I hated mushrooms. He sat in waiting rooms with me. I bring this up because the truth rarely arrives in a shape simple enough to hate cleanly. He was a complicated man who became someone significantly worse the longer money and unchecked ambition were allowed to sit next to whatever good instincts he started with. My father walked me down the aisle, giving a toast so carefully worded and free of detail about his actual business that I felt grateful. I told my dad I wanted to build a life that had nothing to do with what he'd built. My dad just nodded and said, "Just be sure it's him you're protecting yourself from being loved for the wrong reasons, and not something in yourself you haven't looked at yet." The red flags arrived in small installments. 6 months into the marriage, I was 3 months pregnant with Leo. I had a scheduled ultrasound circled on our calendar for weeks. Marcus texted me 40 minutes before the appointment. Chloe needed him to walk a client through a $2.5 million listing that would net her a $75,000 commission. I went to the ultrasound alone. I made it reasonable in my head, the way you do when the alternative is admitting your marriage is failing. Then came the financial control. I had $450,000 in personal savings from a decade of work and my mother's modest inheritance. I suggested we use it as a down payment on a house instead of paying $6,500 a month in rent. Marcus shut it down immediately. "We should keep our finances clean while the business is scaling," he said smoothly. "Commingling funds creates exposure." I didn't know then that keeping our finances clean had nothing to do with protecting me. It was about keeping my name and my father's name close enough to imply wealth, but far enough to deny legal liability. Then there was Helen. When I was 5 months pregnant, I developed mild preeclampsia symptoms. My doctor, Dr. Evans, flagged my elevated blood pressure. Helen called me and told me I was making a very normal pregnancy sound dramatic and stressing Marcus out. When I told Marcus, he sighed, "She's just old-fashioned. Try not to worry her, she has her knee replacement coming up." His mother's elective knee surgery became a reason to ignore my failing blood pressure. 2 weeks before my due date, I was spotting and in severe abdominal pain. I went to the ER alone at 10 p.m. because Marcus was at a vital client dinner. When he finally got home at midnight, Helen was with him. Her first comment? "See, you scared him for nothing." Marcus didn't defend me. He just kissed my forehead and went to eat leftovers while his mother lectured me. But the most damning piece of the puzzle, the sixth hidden pattern, was something I only realized much later. Marcus had been slowly isolating me. My calls with my best friend Jenna were constantly interrupted. My dinners with my father were reduced to maybe 6 brief encounters in 3 years, with Marcus always steering the conversation away from anything personal. "Let's not make things about money tonight," he'd say. He wasn't protecting me. He was managing his 2 lives, making sure my father's actual presence didn't ruin the fake story he was telling his bankers. The absolute breaking point happened at Oakmont, the night I fled. Sarah Chen, my father's ruthless general counsel, had been running the overnight audit. At 6 a.m., she drove to the estate and handed my father a printed packet pulled from an old investor relations file. It was an internal financing memo circulated to lenders for Marcus's Harbor View project. On page 4, under Strategic Relationships, was a single paragraph describing Thorne Development's informal alignment with a prominent regional financial family through the principal's marriage, with a footnote referencing continued relationship building, expected to formalize over time. The memo was dated 14 months before our wedding. I read that date 3 times before it clicked. 14 months before the wedding. Before he ever proposed with a ring he'd priced based on eavesdropping on my friends. Before I ever stood at the altar believing I'd successfully kept my wealth hidden, Marcus had known who my father was before he ever proposed. Someone in his circle, a broker, a lender, had told him. And instead of asking me, he quietly built my father's name into his financing story, dangled it in front of banks to get millions in credit he didn't deserve, and came home every night letting me believe I was hiding a secret. I was the asset. I had been the asset since the gala. My careful secret hadn't protected me from being loved for the wrong reasons, it just meant I never found out I was being used. My father read the memo, set it down carefully, and looked at me. He knew, I echoed, my voice hollow. My father's phone rang. It was the compliance officer from Coastal Trust Bank, panicking about the memo. My father answered, his voice pure ice. "There is no relationship. There never was. I'd encourage your committee to review every representation your bank was given and ask yourselves why nobody called to confirm it with me directly." He hung up and looked at me. "This is going to move fast now. I need you to tell me if you want to be there when it does." I thought about the $3.25 in my coat pocket. I want to be there. Update 2. The execution happened 8 days post-op, at a massive groundbreaking reception for Harbor View's second phase. 60 guests, high-end catering, half the city's banking community in one unfinished lobby. Marcus had called me 15 times over the last few days. Helen left voicemails calling me a cruel, hormonal wife destroying her husband's business. I walked into that reception on my father's arm, wearing a tailored black dress altered that morning to accommodate my bandages. David Hughes walked 2 steps behind us. Sarah Chen was already inside, personally handing a devastating legal folder to every senior lender in the room. Marcus saw me from across the room, mid-toast. I watched his face try to process the sight of Arthur Sterling standing beside me in public for the first time in our marriage. "Elena," he stammered, dropping his champagne glass so hard it spilled. "I didn't know you were coming. You should be resting. I wanted to see the room you built this on," I said loudly. He tried to fake a smile for the crowd. "Everyone, this is my wife, Elena, and her father, Arthur." My father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mr. Thorne," my father said, the room instantly dropping into a deathly silence. "I believe several people in this room have been operating under the impression that my company has some formal relationship with your project. I'd like to clear that up publicly." The bankers froze. "There has never been any financial relationship between Sterling Global and Thorne Development," my father continued. "My daughter kept her own name for reasons that had nothing to do with hiding money from her husband, and everything to do with a fear of exactly this. Mr. Thorne understood who she was years ago and elected to build a business on the implication of my support rather than the fact of it." Thomas Ridge, a senior banker near the bar, looked like he was going to vomit. Marcus's face went the color of wet cement. "That's not Elena, tell them that's not what happened." "I read the memo, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing in the silent lobby, "the one from 14 months before we got married. The one mentioning our family alignment. I can explain that. You've been explaining things to me for 3 years." I cut him off. "I'm done being the audience." Helen pushed through the crowd, her face purple with rage. "You ungrateful brat, after everything this family has done for you, you humiliate him like this?" I looked at the woman who had tormented me for years. "You watched me stand on a curb 4 days after a C-section and get handed bus fare. You fixed your lipstick in my car while it happened. Don't talk to me about family." Chloe stood frozen near the podium, doing the math in her head. She had built 1/3 of her real estate portfolio on referrals tied to this project. Within a month, 3 of her biggest clients would drop her, realizing her connections were radioactive. "I am not the silent partner in this family's story anymore," I announced to the room. I never was. I was just quiet. There's a difference, and it took me a bus ride to learn it. Marcus tried to pull me aside. Elena, please, we can talk about this at home. Not here. You didn't extend me that courtesy on the curb. I whispered, loud enough for the front row to hear. You had a reservation for your mother, I had fresh stitches. You did the math, and I lost. Now, the math is catching up to you. The unraveling was brutally fast. Coastal Trust called their loans by Wednesday. Thorne Development filed for bankruptcy 5 months later with $13 million in liabilities. Harborview was sold at a massive loss to a competitor. During the divorce, Marcus's lawyer tried to claim my paid-off Audi Q7 was a marital asset. Sarah Chen destroyed him in a single email with the purchase documents. The irony? The prenup Marcus had insisted on to keep his business separate, protected my $450,000 savings completely. The only marital assets to divide were his $22,000 in credit card debt and a storage unit of cheap furniture he fought me over for 6 weeks out of pure spite. Marcus eventually moved 2 states away, taking a massive demotion to manage acquisitions for a mid-size firm. He blamed politics for his downfall. I went back to consulting under my real name. I bought a beautiful house 6 blocks from Oakmont with my own money. Leo is 10 weeks old now. Healthy and perfect. My father spoils him endlessly, trying to make up for the years he was forced to watch my marriage from the sidelines. I still think about that $3.25 bus fare. I think about how small an amount of money it takes to tell someone exactly what they are worth to you, if you're careless enough to hand it over in daylight. He thought he was saving cab fare. Instead, it cost him his entire empire.